I used to live in Chicago for 30 years, downtown Chicago, and I had my run-in with rats. We all have had run-ins with rats if we're city dwellers. Come on, doesn't matter if you're wealthy or poor, you see them in the streets. I don't know, you New Yorkers put your trash out like in the front, out by the street, and I've seen like writhing masses of rats just cruising around while I'm just trying to eat at a restaurant or something out on a curb. Anyway, rats are a way of life in the urban world. Now, I have recently moved to an area where I'm living on a wetlands, and so it's sort of like nature all around me. I've got deer going through my backyard, foxes, I've got a weasel that is incredibly devastating as a predator of small rodents, and I've had my fair share of run-ins with mice now. No rats out here, but plenty of mice. Now here's the thing. Mice, very stupid. Rats, really quite smart. And so if you're trapping mice or rats, you have to do it differently. Now, you're saying to yourself, Steve, why are you trapping these animals in the first place? Let nature be its own beautiful thing. No, these things are a menace, and they can cause all kinds of human trouble, including disease. It's a hygiene question, people. Point is this, when you're killing mice, all you have to do is set up a bunch of traps. Put a little peanut butter in there. They'll come, if there's a whole group of them, they'll come, they'll see their friend get its neck snapped, and then they'll go to the peanut butter and they'll get their neck snapped. And you can just get a whole line of them in a row because they're that stupid. But rats are very clever, and it turns out that if you set a trap for rats, they will send a lower ranking male usually to test the food source, and they'll watch. And if it gets its neck snapped, they learn, okay, we're going to stay away from this kind of food, this kind of structure, or whatever it is. And so they learn very quickly, so you can't get them that way. So instead, with rats, you have to basically lay out a bunch of traps, and you have to essentially bait them, what peanut butter, whatever it is you put in there, and then let the rats eat like every night on this bait. You don't actually set the trap. You don't pull the wire back. And so you let this happen for days, like a week, 2 weeks, and then finally, on one night, you basically set all the traps. Now the rats are accustomed to eating here. They all come down, they get their necks snapped. Nature is, as Tennyson said, red in tooth and claw, and humans are part of that as well. In any case, my point is this. Rats are smarter than mice. And so it raises this question that we all have, like, we tend to think of more intelligent animals as higher than unintelligent animals, and that they are lower. There's this kind of quiet assumption of a kind of ladder of animal value. And sometimes it's along the lines of intelligence, and sometimes it's along the lines of like the cuteness factor. Like, we generally think cute animals need to be defended and protected more than ugly animals. So there's a kind of weird aesthetic where we think of cuter animals as higher than ugly animals. One more story, I suppose, to suggest that this is an ongoing issue for myself, and I suspect for you as well. Because I'm living out here in nature, there's a kind of tendency for birds to build their nests. And I've got these beautiful mourning doves building nests like right off my porch. And I think they're beautiful animals, and they don't bother me at all. And it's fun to see them hatch their eggs and teach the young how to fly. And they're sort of feeding the babies with their crop milk. It's fascinating. But it's a Darwinian world, and the squirrels in the area know that they're laying their eggs, and so they'll come around, and basically they will push the eggs out of the nest so that they drop on the ground, and when they hit the ground, they break open, and then squirrels will eat whatever's in there. I know you didn't think squirrels did this, but they do. It's horrifying, but true. Anyway, I know it's circle of life and all, but I don't really want the squirrels to be eating these eggs. So I bought a slingshot. Now the thing is, okay, I have a PhD in philosophy, and I'm out there oftentimes, like in my underwear, shooting a slingshot at squirrels, but I only use unpopped popcorn seeds, just because I want to sting them a little bit with a little negative reinforcement. Give them a little pain when they're coming towards the nest, and they'll stay away. And I have to say, it's quite effective. Just a little. Animals learn very fast. As you know, you have to sort of condition them with either rewards or punishments. So it's working great. But I have been thinking to myself, why do I sort of prize the nest of the mourning doves over the squirrels? They got to eat too. I will say this, my guilt about shooting a popcorn kernel at a squirrel is slightly assuaged by the fact that I am shooting food at it. So I don't know if the reinforcement is negative or positive here. Whatever, I'm just trying to do my best. So all this is to set up our show for today. I want to talk about a big idea in Western thought. It's so big that you can't see it. It's buried deep underground, yet it shapes everything that we do. And it's called the Great Chain of Being. So welcome to Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, and today, the Great Chain of Being. This idea once claimed to organize the entire universe, from angels on the top to oysters on the bottom. The Great Chain of Being was a metaphysical ladder. At the top, God, and then angels, humans, animals, plants, minerals. Every creature had its assigned place in a grand vertical hierarchy. It's not just biologically sort of a ladder, but also morally, spiritually, and even politically. It's basically a worldview that's born in Plato, refined by the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, sort of domesticated by the great Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas, and practically canonized in the Renaissance by most thinkers. It became very popular in the Renaissance with the rebirth of classical ideas, and also mixed with sort of occult mysticism. In the 18th century, however, a Swiss naturalist and philosopher named Charles Bonnet offered a more Enlightenment-friendly version of this cosmic hierarchy. He imagined nature as a continuous series of links, what he called the Great Chain of Being, in which, like, even worms and insects had a rung on the ladder, just very low. Now, why think this way? Well, if you look at nature, it does seem to have a hierarchical organization to it. You look at human beings and you go, okay, well, chimps, bonobos, they look like sort of cruder, less finished humans. They look humanoid. And you then maybe go down to monkeys and you go, well, that looks like it's a cruder form of a higher primate, an ape. And then you go lower and you look at other mammals. So it looks like there's this kind of stacked, almost like the designer was doing rough drafts of every animal. And then, this is sort of, to the naked eye and the uneducated eye, somebody who doesn't have a theory, let's say, about evolution or about how the world was made, would see these interesting parallels between, anatomy. So Charles Bonnet was a brilliant systematizer. He believed that all organisms were connected in a linear sequence of increasing complexity, and that this sequence reflected divine order. Even embryos, to Charles Bonnet, were preformed miniatures, each nested like Russian dolls inside the last, going all the way back to Eve. It's beautiful and it's kind of bonkers. So for Bonnet, he thought inside the female human, obviously you have the uterus, and inside the uterus you have the egg. But Bonnet thought, how do you basically have the sperm meet this unformed egg, and you have these two kind of unformed things, and it starts to build a thoroughly articulated humanoid body? Like, that just seems to be getting something from nothing. So he thought the structure must already be there, and then the sperm just activates the structure and starts adding material to it, so it's getting bigger and bigger. It's a clever way to solve this problem. How do you go from unformed miscellaneous stuff to highly formed, articulate human? But he solves it by basically saying there's always these fully articulated humans. They're just basically in a state of potentiality, and then the process of like sperm meeting the egg activates them. The problem with this, though, is that you've got, for Bonnet, you have to have inside, let's say, a mother who's about to have a baby, is not just her baby, but inside that baby is another baby, and inside that baby is another baby, and that's what I mean by nested Russian dolls. Every human being is already in existence, according to Bonnet, just waiting to be activated. Now, that's a long way to go to solve this sort of embryology problem, but you can see this also tied to his idea that the whole universe is filled with every possible organism. And this is the idea, it's called the Principle of Plenitude in philosophy, and other people were really influenced by it and really liked it. philosophers like Leibniz, for example. And the idea sort of embraced by Bonnet and other sort of mystical biologists of the Enlightenment era is that God creates the universe, God is perfect, so every potentiality must be realized. That's what it meant to them to be perfect. And that meant that every possible existing being, every possible species must exist somewhere. Maybe not in this universe, maybe in a kind of multiverse situation where we've got parallel universes. But for Bonnet and Leibniz and others, the idea was that it was the best of all possible worlds in which God creates in a way that's so florid and so elaborate as to include every possibility that is not a logical contradiction. God doesn't create logical contradictions. That doesn't make sense. So that's the only thing he won't create, apparently. He can't make unmarried bachelors or square circles, but basically everything else God makes, and it must exist somewhere too. So that's the principle of plenitude, and it informs this idea of a great chain of being, where every possible organism and species exists, but some of them we're just not seeing. Some of them we can see, like apes, are sort of just below humans, and humans are just below angels, and angels are below God. But some of them are just so infinitely complex and varied that we don't perceive them. Now, after this idea gets fully ensconced in the 18th century, along comes Darwin in the 19th century and sort of kicks it in the head, or pick your metaphor, he breaks the chain of being. Darwin didn't just tweak the order of nature, he kind of threw out the ladder altogether. In its place, we get the idea of a branching tree or a bush, common descent, and natural selection. So evolution wasn't marching upward, it was sprawling outward. Organisms weren't higher or lower, they were just more or less adapted to their ecological niche. So on this view, nature was no longer a moral hierarchy, it was an adaptive experiment. I was suggesting that, intelligence seems like it's more important, and yet there are organisms that survive even better without intelligence. This is the kind of joke about cockroaches, they'll live forever, and you think about these sea sponges that haven't changed for millions of years, in some cases, like hundreds of millions of years. And it's because they survive well without intelligence. So intelligence itself is not intrinsically good, it just happens to be helpful for human beings and some other organisms, but you do find with other kinds of adaptive structures and functions. I was reading a recent paper that basically polled people about their attitudes towards nature, and they tried to understand, what do we think of as higher and lower in nature? And one way to understand that is to think about, what are your feelings about animal testing? So it turns out that, if you think an animal is really valuable, you don't want it to be subjected to scientific testing. Whereas if you think it's lower on this hierarchy of value, then you don't feel as bad about animal testing. So it turns out there's some interesting facts. For example, younger people are more opposed to animal testing, animal experiments, than older people are. Women are much more opposed to it than men are. Urban dwellers are more opposed to animal testing than rural people are. And finally, Catholics are more opposed to it than Protestants. Now, these are all very interesting. They all kind of have interesting explanations. That's something we could explore maybe in another show. I have my own theories about some of this too, but fascinating. The writers of this research identified sort of three different areas where, multiple areas, but three stuck out to me as to what's motivating this view. One is the idea we've already discussed, which is that if you think an animal is super smart, like a dolphin or a chimp, you don't want to eat it for the most part, and you don't want it to be experimented on. Two is the issue of neoteny. Neoteny is a term which means that the animal preserves its juvenile features into adulthood. So humans, for example, are neotenous. Like compared to our primate cousins, we retain juvenile characteristics, bigger head, bigger eyes. Our brain doesn't basically develop for the most part until way after we're born, whereas for most animals it's much more developed prior to being born. The puppy dog face is incredibly activating for our empathy, our concern, our care. So anything with big eyes and looks youthful is something that draws our sense of value to it. And finally, maybe anything with sort of a primate body plan reminds us of ourselves. So we're much more resistant to any kind of animal testing or eating these kinds of animals. But if Darwin's right, then there really is no value hierarchy except the one we're putting on it. We should feel just as good or just as bad eating a chimp and a dolphin as we do, insects. But here's the twist. Even though science sort of abandoned the chain, we really as human beings have not abandoned the great chain of being, and maybe we can't abandon it entirely. The idea still haunts our folk psychology. We see dolphins as more evolved than slugs. And when we rank creatures by intelligence or beauty or complexity, that's the great chain sort of whispering in our ear. It sneaks into our ethics, our aesthetics, even our environmentalism. So we don't just describe nature, we want to valorize it. The lion is noble, the snake is lowly, the eagle is exalted. That's not Darwin, that's Plato sneaking in to remind us that human beings have to see the world poetically, not just scientifically. Okay, as usual, if you enjoy the show, please check out our Patreon page, or just, share the show with your friends, send it to them. The like button, the whole routine. There's a million content creators out there. We're just one lowly, small, low rung on the ladder of content creators. So please help us out if you can. We're really having fun making the show, and we appreciate your support. Until next time, always stay curious.